In response to Serbian aggression and the crisis in the Balkans, Austria-Hungary passes a bill to increase its army size to 600,000 men and authorized an expansion to an additional 2 million men in the event of war. At a ceremony commemorating the Battle of the Nations, Kaiser Wilhelm confided in the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hertzendorf, saying, quote, "I am with you. Within a few days you must be in Belgrade. I was always a partisan of peace, but this has its limits. I have read much about war, and I know what it means. But finally, a situation arises in which a great power can no longer just look on, but must draw the sword." On the 18th, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. On the 19th, Arthur Zimmermann, Deputy Foreign Minister of Germany, told the British ambassador to Berlin, Edward Goshen, that, quote, he had been surprised that the Emperor of Austria endorsed a policy which, under certain circumstances, might lead to serious consequences, but he had done so, and that made it clear still that restraining advice at Vienna on the part of Germany was out of the question. Germany had also increased the size of their standing army from 544,000 to 661,000. Upon announcing this increase, German Chancellor Hallwig stated, quote, "One thing that remains beyond doubt, if it ever should come to a European conflagration which sets Slaventum against Germanentum, then it is for us a disadvantage that the position in the balance of forces which was hitherto occupied by European Turkey is now filled in part by Slav states. Slav states such as Serbia." 10 months earlier, Kaiser Wilhelm II had confided in Archduke Franz Ferdinand that Germany would back Austria in all situations, even if it meant a war with Russia and France. However, on October 25, 1913, Serbia accedes to Austria-Hungary's ultimatum and pulls out of Albania, and no further action is taken by Germany or Austria-Hungary. The Balkan War previously between Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro versus the Ottoman Empire had ended 5 months earlier, and the point of contention was Serbia taking land from Albania so as to have access to the sea. With Serbia's withdrawal, the October crisis is ended, and a general war in Europe is averted. One way of thinking that has annoyed me is this notion of what I call inevitabilism. World War I was inevitable. It was bound to happen. Now, I'm not interested in a philosophical discussion about determinism or how ultimately everything we see is just the culmination of the deterministic behavior of atoms. That's nice to know, but we're operating at a much grosser phenomenological level. So let's just skip that silly discussion. What's of practical consideration is the question, does individual behavior matter, or is everything driven by forces of history? One problem with inevitabilism is that people will look at the past from whatever sources they have and then recount the chain of events that led to the present and then go, well, based on this chain of events, it was all inevitable. And in the sense that what happened happened, sure, but could one individual have changed the direction of everything with a decisive action at a key point? Looking at the crisis of October 1913, regarding that Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia, backed by Germany, with Russia's participation a wild card, we see a very similar situation to that which would occur just 9 months later in July of 1914, but with a very different outcome. To recap the situation, the Serbs wanted self-rule, and they were willing to fight the Ottoman Empire for it, and they did so, and they won. So they have their state, but there are areas of Serbian majority within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including in Bosnia, which is where Sarajevo is located. Serbia was always stirring up trouble in those areas, and what Austria-Hungary would really have liked to do was to just invade Serbia and set up some sort of puppet regime and keep the Serbs in line by force, or worse, we'll never know. But Austria-Hungary couldn't very easily just do that because Russia. Though Russia herself was in a difficult situation, because although Russia kind of took on the mantle as the champion of all Slavic peoples, they were still a multi-ethnic empire ruled by a dynasty, the Romanovs. And this idea that self-identified nations have the right to self-rule and not be ruled by dynasties, this was not a precedent that the Romanovs wanted upheld, given that ethnic Russians only made up around 60% of the Russian Empire. In fact, in 1848, Russia intervened in the Hungarian Revolution to restore Habsburg rule over Hungarian lands, with the idea that the Russians did not want ideas of self-determination spreading to Poland or Ukraine. And in fact, Russia had previously had to put down a revolution in Poland and destroy the not long-lasting government, Congress Poland. And so, as you know, on June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, Serbian nationalist, Black Hands, kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne. Now, at this point, I don't think war was inevitable. And certainly the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not set off any kind of crisis. But then Austria draws up another ultimatum to Serbia and sends this ultimatum to Serbia on July 19th. This is the beginning of the crisis and why it is called the July crisis, not the June crisis. The details of the ultimatum are unimportant because Austria-Hungary just wanted to invade Serbia, and the point of this ultimatum was for it to be rejected, and that would be the pretense for war. With a good chance, the Austrians thought that the Russians wouldn't intervene, given that the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia was a war between nationalism and dynastic rule. So Serbia agrees to all but one of the conditions of the ultimatum. This is done on July 23rd. The next day, Kaiser Wilhelm II hears of Serbia's response, and he's overjoyed. He believes that this is sufficient for Austria-Hungary to save face, to punish Serbia, and avoid a terrible war. Wilhelm, unfortunately, doesn't send a telegram to Franz Joseph I, the Emperor of Austria, telling him this. Telling him, don't invade Serbia, that Germany believes Serbia's response is sufficient. No, Wilhelm instead decides to send his message to Francis Joseph I via a private courier, because it's a more important kind of message. Well, the result is, by the time Wilhelm's message arrives, Austria-Hungary has already declared war on Serbia on July 28th. And it's possible that had Wilhelm been more prompt, that Austria-Hungary would not have declared war on Serbia, believing that they did not have a blank check of support from Germany. Now, if you think this is crazy, if you think that Francis Joseph would have gone to war anyway, believing that Germany would follow along no matter what, remember that war had previously been avoided in October of 1913 precisely because Germany told Austria that if Serbia got out of Albania, that the war was off. But forget preventing the war outright. There's a very real chance that Austria-Hungary could have localized the war had they attacked Serbia quickly. Austria-Hungary issued the ultimatum to Serbia on July 19th, 21 days after Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated, and this delay probably caused Russia and France to enter the war. I say this because on July 20th, there was a summit between France and Russia in St. Petersburg where they agreed that their alliance extended to protecting Serbia. Before July 20th, this was an open question. Would France go to war with Germany over Russia's invasion of Germany and Austria-Hungary in order to protect Serbia? But on July 20th, that issue had been resolved. The answer was yes. And these kinds of summits are planned weeks in advance. They didn't decide to have the St. Petersburg summit one day after Austria's ultimatum. This had been in the cards for a while. Had Austria-Hungary quickly invaded Serbia within a week of Ferdinand's assassination, as the German General Staff had been haranguing them to do, it's possible that the Austro-Hungarians could have crushed Serbia before Russia had time to mobilize. On top of this, once Austria-Hungary declared war, it took them 15 days to actually invade Serbia. They declared war on July 28th, but didn't actually invade Serbia until August 12th. And there are several reasons why it took Austria so long to issue the ultimatum to Serbia, then so long to actually declare war. One of which was the Hungarian Prime Minister was dragging his feet apparently. According to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, Hungary had the right to veto some of Austria's foreign policy moves, even if Austria was generally in charge of the military and foreign policy. Another was the KUK Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hertzendorf's decision to allow the army to go on harvest leave even after Franz Ferdinand had been killed. So to start a war, those men would all have to be called back and reorganized into units, and that takes time. As for the declaration of war being on July 28th before Austria-Hungary was prepared to invade Serbia on August 12th, that may have had to do with there being so many factions in Austria-Hungary that a formal declaration of war was necessary simply to unify everyone into taking actions towards the war. Getting everyone on the same page may have required an outright declaration of war. But the result of this was that Russia got 15 days to mobilize and draw off Austro-Hungarian troops before Austria-Hungary could defeat Serbia. And as a result, Austria-Hungary had to pull troops from Serbia before they could knock it out to prevent the Russians from breaking into the Carpathians. And of course, we know Serbia got 15 more days to prepare as well. Now, here's a trippy way to look at all this stuff. In the real world, Wilhelm II sent his message to Franz Joseph via telegram. It reached Joseph. Joseph decides not to go to war with Serbia, and there's no Great War. And what we think of as the Great War, it's just one of these sort of weird, horrible, apocalyptic, alternative history things you'll see on sort of the alt history Reddit boards. And it's in there with like, what if the United Kingdom invaded the United States during the Civil War in 1861? And that we're not actually living in the real world. We're actually living in some bizarre alternative history where all these horrible wars happened and that these European monarchies don't exist anymore. Like in the real world, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire still exist. I think of it like that, and we're in the alternate history. And remember, Russia's entry into the war was not a foregone conclusion given that Serbia was a nation-state fighting against a multi-ethnic dynastic empire, and the cause of war had been Serbia's support for a terrorist group, one which killed a king. So it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Tsar Nicholas II, the dynastic ruler of a multi-ethnic empire whose army was regularly putting down nationalist revolts, would enter the war on the side of a regicidal nationalist regime against another multi-ethnic imperial dynasty. Have I hit you over the head with this enough? Now, by August 1914, there's a lot of what-ifs about the Schlieffen Plan and how they should have made it stronger, and on that I just have to say no. By this time, the Schlieffen Plan was dead because of Austria-Hungary's late start. You can point to specific decisions at specific battles, but from August 1914 to October 28, 1914, the war was largely preordained. What happened, I think, was sort of bound to happen given the previous events. The Germans had to send troops from France to Russia in order to prevent a collapse. They had to do this, and so they had to weaken the Schlieffen Plan and arguably prevented Germany from knocking out France in 1914, as I believe France would have ended the war if Paris fell. The decision to invade Belgium obviously sealed Britain's entry into the war, and it's arguable whether or not Britain would have entered anyway. Think of it like this. The Germans thought they could quickly knock out France, but to do so they had to go through Belgium. The direct border with France and Germany was too well fortified, and the terrain was too tough. Whereas Belgium was comparatively soft militarily, and of course their border with France was totally open and flat. And the Germans knew that invading Belgium probably meant Britain enters the war. But the reasoning was that Britain would find some excuse to enter the war on the side of France eventually anyway. So why not just knock France out? And if not for Austria-Hungary's late mobilization and late attack on Serbia, I believe Germany would have taken Paris, and that France would have exited the war if Paris was captured or encircled or in imminent threat of being captured. Obviously, France could fight past the loss of Paris if they had the will to, but I don't believe they would have. But also keep in mind, Germany managed to occupy, from what I have heard, about half of France's industrial capacity, however that's quantified, with the territory they took in that initial attack. Obviously, it was eventually reconstituted elsewhere later, but let's say that the attack through Belgium brought Britain into the war 6 months earlier than they would otherwise have. Is that worth taking however much of the French industry they took and being able to fight the whole war in France instead of in Germany? Obviously, if the German attack through Belgium actually knocked out France, we would definitely say it was worth it. But even as it actually happened, with the advance petering out toward the Marne, it's not exactly clear that it wasn't worth it for Germany. Sure, it brought Britain in. Well, Britain probably would have come in anyway, and at least now you get to fight in France instead of in Germany, and you've taken a bunch of area that had a bunch of industry and, of course, men that France no longer has access to. The Ottoman Empire. The decision by the Ottomans to enter the war is confusing to a lot of people, as it seems that the Ottomans didn't really have a dog in this fight. And as we know with hindsight, the Ottoman Empire entering the war was the immediate cause of its ultimate breaking apart. But the Ottoman decision to enter the war was actually very logical. The Ottomans had been losing territory for some time. They lost Tunisia to France, they lost Egypt and Sudan to Britain, and more recently in 1912, Italy, with virtually no justification, just invaded Libya, and so the Ottomans lost Libya to Italy. I remember the supposed justification Italy had, but it was so convoluted, and it had something to do with French troops in Morocco and how France moving troops out of Morocco somehow gave Italy the justification to take Libya. It was really convoluted. It was really Talmudic the way Italy justified their invasion of Libya. But essentially, Italy wanted Libya, and they correctly assessed that they could take the Ottomans in Libya, and they did. In 1914, the Ottomans were supposed to receive 2 modern battleships from Britain. However, following the outbreak of the war, Britain canceled this order, but the British did not cancel a similar order of Greek warships when the war broke out. Greeks who had also taken significant territory from the Ottomans, and the Greeks, of course, wanted more territory from the Ottomans. And well before that, the Russians had taken land from the Ottomans in the Caucasus and in Romania. Then, of course, there were the Balkan Wars that cost them the regions of Serbia, Romania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro and Albania. This was definitely the most devastating loss for the Ottoman Empire, which the Western Allies did not intervene in. Remember when Austria had to deal with the Hungarian separatists and Russia intervened to help maintain Habsburg rule? Russia did not do this to help maintain Ottoman rule over the Balkan states, nor did anyone else. So at this point, what power can the Ottomans then call a friend? And the answer was the Germans. At least the Germans were the closest thing to a friend. The Germans had no territorial designs on the Ottoman lands. The Germans had a somewhat adversarial position vis-a-vis France and Britain, who the Ottomans definitely had an adversarial position to. And because Russia signed an alliance with France, Germany now had an adversarial relationship with Russia. Germany was also strongly aligned to Austria-Hungary because, hot take, Austria-Hungary was just an extension of Germany, but that's a topic for another time. But Italy had territorial designs on Austria-Hungary, which despite supposedly having an alliance with Italy, in fact put Austria-Hungary and by extension Germany as being somewhat adversarial to Italy. So did I miss anyone here? You had a perfect storm where Germany and Austria-Hungary's allegiances perfectly meshed with those of the Ottomans. On top of that, the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians were multi-ethnic dynastic empires, not nation-states, and so they had similar views on how to deal with national separatists in the Balkans or anywhere else. On the issue of Serbian independence, the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans were of very like mind. Contrary to what many people might think, the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia was not seen as some aggression against the Ottomans by the Ottomans, as the Ottomans had long lost administrative control of that region. And really, the Austro-Hungarians took Bosnia not because they wanted it, they really didn't. It cost them more to keep order there than it brought in tax revenue, and it was, as we say, a cup of trembling politically. But the Austrians took Bosnia to prevent the Serbs from taking it, as the Ottomans could no longer hold it. By 1914 then, the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians were both empires in a similar kind of crisis. They were both thinking about survival, not expansion, and they were not adversarial toward each other. So okay, alliance is one thing, why then did the Ottomans enter this particular war? Well, because it was all or nothing. If Germany or Austria lost this war, then the Ottomans would be without allies. And as had been going on previously, without German or Austro-Hungarian support, there's no reason to believe that the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which had been going on up to that point, wouldn't just continue. From the Ottoman point of view, if Germany and Austria-Hungary lost this war, that would be the end of their empire, whether or not the Ottomans were involved. But also, the Ottomans had the Dardanelles, and this could cut Russia off from the west, as Germany had already cut off the Baltic. And so Ottoman entry into the war, despite the Ottomans not necessarily being able to project power to, say, cut off the Suez Canal or really throw their weight around against the other powers, they had a profound effect simply by cutting Russia off from the west, as Russia's two main sources of access to the West was through the Baltic and through the Black Sea. Now, of course, Russia could still get stuff shipped overland through Persia and Afghanistan, or through the Arctic way, or as a last resort across the Siberian Railroad, but the throughput from those avenues could not replace the Baltic and the Black Sea. And that's why the British attacked at Gallipoli, because the Germans and the Ottomans were choking off Russia. In fact, there were similar debates surrounding an attempt to try to break through the Denmark Straits and open the Baltic to Russia, but that was considered to be a far more dangerous plan, given that the German Navy was a near peer and that the area control required to reopen the Baltic was about 100 times that needed for reopening the Black Sea. And I've heard some argue that Russia would not have had a communist revolution if not for the German and Ottoman blockades. And this seems plausible because Russia almost didn't have a communist revolution anyway. So the additional pressure that cutting off the Black Sea trade route put on the Russian state may have been that little extra pressure needed to radicalize the population enough to support the Bolsheviks. And this is why the French and British kept attacking in 1915 and 1916, even when such attacks seemed insane, going over the top over and over again. Because as we know, World War I had a huge defender advantage, probably the biggest defender advantage at any time in world history. The equipment favored defense, and the size of the armies meant that the traditional attacker advantage of local overmatch was negated, as you couldn't get as much of an overmatch at any one location because both sides were able to fully saturate the battle area and have reserves behind that. The Germans were able to gain ground early simply because they mobilized faster than everyone else and because the French still thought it was 1871. But once the French figured it out, the line stabilized, and the Germans took a defensive posture deep in France and sent more troops to Russia for the war of maneuver over there that the Germans thought they could win. But the French were not going to allow Germany to just sit in France as they focused on Russia. The French were not going to let Germany just take one guy out just so that they could then turn and take out France. France could not let Russia fall, but what could France do? They had to do something to take the pressure off Russia, so they attacked. They attacked in waves over no man's land to try to force the Germans to keep troops in France. These attacks got so bad that you had the French mutinies. Now, it should be noted that these were not anti-war mutinies, but mutinies against going over the top over and over again, because the soldiers didn't know why they were being ordered to do so. They didn't understand that they had to take pressure off Russia, and even if they did know that, they might not even care. Enter Pétain. Pétain rewrote French offensive doctrine in 1916 in what became known as methodical battle. And while the French didn't achieve any great breakthroughs using methodical battle, they managed very slowly and very methodically to achieve something close to parity and bite by bite nibble away at the German holdings in France. Pétain, in my opinion, put France back in the war. So all of these attempts at taking pressure off Russia, was it wise for the West to do so? I think the answer is yes. And the evidence that the Western powers were very smart to attack to take pressure off Russia was seen quite rudely in the 1918 spring offensives. Which gets us to another one of these key decision points here. The German decision to come to peace terms with the Soviet Union in 1918. The situation then was that there were almost no Soviet-Russian units able to face the Germans by December of 1917, given the revolution and the Civil War. And the Soviets and the Germans signed a ceasefire and they began negotiations in December 1917. Yet the Germans kept over 1 million men there and were insistent upon making a peace deal. Leon Braunstein kept delaying the negotiations because he knew that the Germans were desperate to get those troops into France. So eventually, Braunstein, or more commonly known as Trotsky, said, "No war, no peace," and ended the negotiations there without any treaty. And so the Germans just started advancing against no oppositions and just started occupying towns and cities. So it's kind of interesting. Trotsky sort of had this mentality of what if there was a war and nobody showed up? But as it turned out, no, you're really fighting this war and you need to figure out what you're gonna do. Like the army is actually here, they can actually take stuff. And so Lenin then intervened and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But even after signing that treaty, the Germans still left around 500,000 men to garrison that territory and sent the other 500,000 to France in a last-ditch attempt to knock France out before the arrival of US troops. Which is to say, Soviet stalling at the negotiation table kept, as we were to learn, 500,000 men in Russia for 3 months. Without all that Stalin, there never would have been Stalin. Oh, that was really bad. Okay. But what if the German high command looked at the situation in Russia then and said, you know, the Soviets have no army to field against us. They're stuck in a civil war, and if we want territory in Russia, we can always just come back. Instead of 500,000 men, let's take 950,000 men and pour those into France and leave 5 divisions of 50,000 men and put them back to the German and Polish borders. And then once the war with France is over, then we can send those troops back into Russia, and at that point, with France knocked out, we can just take whatever we want from Russia. But then there's the question, would an additional 450,000 men have gotten the Germans to Paris in 1918? And if the Germans got to Paris in 1918, would that have ended the war? Well, the imminent capture of Paris did not end the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 as the French fought past the fall of their capital. But consider if Germany was willing to give a white peace in 1918. Say the French lines are broken. The Germans have penetrated and the Allies are scrambling to find forces to plug the gaps. The Germans have captured Paris and the Americans are still a week or two away from arriving in force. And even when they do arrive, as we know it, will take them time to be competitive with the Germans. And if the line were to stabilize somewhere past Paris, well, now what? Were the Allies going to engage in that methodical battle with rolling artillery barrages through Paris onward to Germany and do this until 1921? Were they willing to turn Paris into a moonscape? Was France willing to do that? My belief is no. My belief is that France would not be willing to do that, and that the German capture of France would have ended the war. On top of that, because the Germans were facing food riots at home, they needed the blockade to end, and Germany had already offered multiple white pieces to France and Britain prior, or status quo pieces. On top of that, the regime requirements for the war would be satisfied with the empire in Russia. Because one problem for the German regime is that they had to tell a story to its population what the war was for. We had all this suffering. What was it for? In World War II, obviously the war made Europe far less stable in 1945 than it was in 1939, and it did not save Poland. So the Western regimes needed to have a story that they could tell their population what was it all for. Because if they just go back to their populations and say, hey, we massively botched the foreign policy here. We started a war with Germany that was completely unnecessary, and the end result was that Europe is a lot less stable now than it was in 1939 and far more dangerous. Oh, and by the way, the communists have half the continent as well. That would be a very hard sell. So the regimes in the West needed a story for what World War II was all about, and so they really latched on to the Holocaust and the evilness of the Nazi regime. That's the point of all this stuff. Not saying the Holocaust didn't happen, but those regimes needed something like the Holocaust in order to retroactively legitimize what was, quite frankly, their colossal and unforgivable foreign policy blunder. That was World War II. But back to World War I. Given the land the Germans in World War I got, or were going to get from Russia, that's what they could then say the war was for. They didn't need anything from France at the table. They didn't need to go to their population and say, here's what we got from France. They didn't need that. We got plenty of stuff from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. We don't need anything from France. And so Germany could afford, politically, a white peace. And if France needed something from Germany to justify their involvement in the war, Germany could just give away their colonies, or at a very last resort, Germany could give away the Alsace-Lorraine, which if they were smart, they would do that. In hindsight, they would obviously do that. So the theme of this video was supposed to be arguing against historical determinism, and frankly, I think just knowing a lot of things about what happened is enough to make you no longer a historical determinist. Germany's blank check to Austria-Hungary is something that could have very easily not happened. Austria-Hungary could have very easily accepted Serbia's response to the ultimatum. But then, barring these, once war happened, the war could have been localized had Austria attacked swiftly. Instead, they waited a month, time for France and Russia to resolve to defend Serbia. Okay, barring that, once the war was generalized, Germany could have not declared war on France, not invaded Belgium, and just sat, forcing France to invade directly into Germany, and making it harder for Britain to declare war on Germany. The war in the West could have been radically different. I'm not saying that would have been a good move on Germany's part. I think that's debatable. And I'm not trying to say that I'm smarter than any of these people in the past. 2020 hindsight, we're all geniuses. We're all master strategists of yesterday's battle. Ottoman entry into the war is very easily something that could have not what happened. And Russia delaying the Germans for 3 months of negotiations, that's definitely something that the Germans very quickly could have quashed. They could have started advancing the day that it looked like they were being stalled, and Lenin would have come running to the table very fast. And on top of that, the Germans could have sent more troops to France in 1918 instead of focusing on occupying the Brest-Litovsk territories right away, with the knowledge that they can always come back and take the land in Russia when France is knocked out. Now, my point in saying all this stuff is, it's not, oh look how smart I am. If these guys had save states, if Hindenburg and Ludendorff had save states, they almost certainly would have won the war. In fact, any of these powers that had save states could have very easily have won everything. But they didn't have save states, they were all playing locked in Iron Man mode. I have the benefit of hindsight. The point I'm making is that any one of these little, almost casual decisions can radically alter the timetable of events, which could radically alter what happened on the battlefields, which would have radically changed the whole world. And here's another thing I want to talk about. It was inevitable that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doomed. The funny thing is that at the outbreak of World War I, the KUK had fears of and contingency plans in place for if various nationalities throughout the empire chose to not show up for conscription. That once they sent out the conscription order, they had a fear that the Czechs or the Slovaks or even the Slavic peoples would not show up for conscription. But this simply didn't happen. In this multinational empire, where no one ethnicity made up over 25% of the population, they managed to conscript 2.25 million men. Of course, this was less than France, who, with a population of about 12 million fewer, managed to conscript 4 million men at the outbreak of war. Obviously, France was far more efficient man for man than Austria-Hungary. But Austria-Hungary lost about 4% of its population in the war, about the same as Germany and slightly less than France. And yes, we know of the Czech Legion that surrendered to Russia and later went on to have the impact it did in the Russian Civil War. However, on the whole, there was not some mass mutiny in the Austro-Hungarian army, nor was there in France. That was a protest to a very specific tactic. There was no mass mutiny in the French army. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire held. And some real talk here, the Austro-Hungarian Empire held under an amount of pressure that the United States and the United Kingdom have never faced. Even the US Civil War only took about 2.5% of the US population. So it's doomed, doomed I say. Why? The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up in 1919 by the Western Alliance. That's what happened. Sure, there was a revolution in 1848, and if Russia hadn't intervened then perhaps it would have been doomed. Perhaps the Hungarians would have held off the Austrians, but probably not, because the Austrians were winning that war. They were gaining ground. They were taking back Hungary before Russia intervened. But certainly by 1917, these kinds of separatists had all been quelled with the exception of the Serbs. So unless it was ripped apart by a foreign power, the Austria-Hungarian Empire seemed here to stay. And it was here to stay until it was literally ripped apart by foreign military powers. Austria-Hungary was not stagnating economically. Sure, it wasn't on the level of France, but it was ahead of Italy in terms of total GDP, and it arguably had more upside potential. In terms of wars against foreign powers, as we've seen, their alliance with Germany, which alongside their favorable trade deals with Germany, made them essentially a part of Greater Germany. And when you see it that way, then it begins to click a little bit. Before the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, there was a debate between Big Germany and Little Germany. Big Germany would be if Austria was the unifying agent, and so Germany would include the whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Little Germany would be if Prussia was the unifying agent, and so would not include the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1 year later, in 1867, Austria lost, and then you got the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, which gave Hungary more political autonomy. So, was Austria-Hungary viable as a geopolitical entity? Frankly, it was as viable as the House of Hohenzollern. And guess what? It turned out to be as viable as the House of Hohenzollern. So of course it was viable. Austria-Hungary had a population of about 53 million in 1907, compared to 67 million for Germany, 39 million for France, and 40 million for Britain. Japan had 42 million, and Italy had around 35 million. By population, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was fourth among the European powers, beaten out only by Russia and the United States, along with Germany, but no matter, as Germany was an ally. Now we all know that Austria-Hungary punched well below its weight when engaged in interstate combat. You cannot expect a multi-ethnic empire to have the same organization and fighting spirit as a nation state, but their weight was pretty high, and that said, they were able to soundly thrash Italy. And even after all of Austria-Hungary and Germany's foibles in World War I, invading Serbia late, botching the opening by not knocking out either Serbia or France early, dragging Britain and then the United States into the war by invading Belgium and then engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare respectively. Even after all of these blunders, Germany and Austria-Hungary still almost pulled it off. And if the Central Powers won, would the world have been a better place? My belief is yes. With the United States now in the global system and Britain and France in explicit alliance at the outset, this Germany, which is really this Germany, would have been contained. And certainly the peoples in those areas would have been much better off than they ended up being under the Soviet Union. If you think not, if you think that there's no way that this Middle Europe could have been contained, well, this was contained. The Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So here's an overlay of territory to visualize the difference between the Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact and Germany's Middle Europe. The gray area is the land that would have only been part of Middle Europe. The bright red is what would have only been part of the USSR and Warsaw Pact. And the red-gray territory is land common to both Middle Europe and the Soviet Union Warsaw Pact. And so the difference between having to contain the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact versus having to contain Germany and Middle Europe would be the gray area on one side and the bright red area on the other. So pick your poison. But of course this ignores the territory the Soviet Union had in Siberia and Central Asia, which was a source of chaff manpower and more importantly a source of natural resources. And of course in the scenario of Middle Europe, the Western powers would have the rump of Russia to work with versus what actually happened, they had the rump of Germany to work with. Now I would concede that working with Soviet Russia would have been much more difficult than working with West Germany to try to contain the opposing power. But I think this could have been done so long as a pragmatist like Lenin or Stalin were in charge. And I think all this could have happened if Germany didn't get bogged down at the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk and didn't try to occupy Russia straight away and started pulling troops from the east in January of 1918 instead of April of 1918. Just a simple decision, one which nobody at the time could have seen as being as important as it ultimately was. Yet with hindsight, we see that these small, almost casual decisions completely changed the map of the world. A weak or even no Soviet Union, the survival and expansion of the Habsburg Empire, the creation of a multi-ethnic German empire to the north. I'm not saying this is necessarily better than what's happened, although I think it is. I'm just saying it's so profound a different world given a few small changes of decisions. My point is not, wouldn't it have been great if? Because the past is done, we're not changing it. My point is that when you boil down world events to key actors and key actions, it's blatant that while yes, the leaders of Russia are piloting a big ship, and that ship has mostly to do with the people that comprise it, the captains of the ship can steer it to disaster, or less often to good things. When dealing with millions of people, sure, thinking in grand forces may make more sense. But when talking about a key decision to let your men go on harvest leave, to keep a military presence in Russia after January 1918, to declare war on Serbia 15 days before you can actually attack. These are all small decisions made by relatively few people, often a single person, that will radically alter battlefield success, which radically alters what states control what territories, which will radically alter how 200 million people think, act, and live. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, please consider donating via Maker Support, PayPal, or Patreon linked in the description. Patreon is done on a per video basis, the others are monthly. And you can go back and see that I don't just churn out videos. I want the individual viewer to watch my stuff and go, neat, that was worth $3. And for me, these videos take anywhere from 12 to 20 hours to make. Also, let me know if I should do more history style videos in the future. Not the immediate future, as coming up next will be the Free Soil series.